On a cold November morning in 1895, a carriage approached St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Thousands of spectators had gathered outside, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. 300 policemen lined the streets, struggling to hold back crowds desperate for a glimpse of the bride. This was the wedding of the century, a union that would join one of America's greatest fortunes to one of England's most ancient titles. But inside that carriage, 18-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt was weeping. She arrived late, not fashionably late as society columnists would later spin it, but genuinely, heartbreakingly late. Because she could not stop crying. Her face, which writers had called the most beautiful in America, was swollen with tears. Her eyes, described by one playwright as so compelling he would stand all day in the street just to watch her pass, were red and desperate. She was about to marry a man she did not love, a man who did not love her, a man whose only interest in her was the fortune that would come with her hand. As she walked down the aisle toward Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, those closest to her could see her trembling. Behind her veil, tears continued to fall. She was not walking toward a future she had chosen. She was being delivered, like goods to a purchaser, in exchange for something her mother wanted more than her daughter's happiness. A title, a place in the aristocracy. A victory over every social rival who had ever looked down upon the newly wealthy Vanderbilts. The groom had arrived late himself, delayed by last-minute negotiations to squeeze even more money from the Vanderbilt fortune. He stood at the altar with the cold efficiency of a businessman completing a transaction. And in many ways, that is exactly what this was. The New York Times periodically printed lists of sums changing hands in such marriages between American heiresses and titled but impoverished European nobles. They called these young women dollar princesses. Consuelo Vanderbilt was about to become the most famous of them all. But to understand how this young woman came to stand weeping at the altar of her own wedding, we must go back to the beginning. Back to the world that created her, the mother who controlled her, and the impossible choice she was never allowed to make. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2nd, 1877, into a world of unimaginable wealth. Her great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built a transportation empire that touched nearly every railroad and shipping line in America. By the time Consuelo took her first breaths, the family name was synonymous with money itself. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was a railroad millionaire many times over. Her childhood homes included a palatial mansion on Fifth Avenue that could host 1,000 guests and a summer cottage in Newport called Marble House, modeled after Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon at Versailles. But for all this luxury, Consuelo's childhood was marked by something far darker than gilded ballrooms and crystal chandeliers. It was marked by her mother. Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt was not born into wealth. She came from Mobile, Alabama, her family's fortune decimated by the Civil War. She arrived in New York society with nothing but her fierce ambition and an unshakable determination to climb higher than anyone thought possible. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt and immediately set about conquering the social world that had initially rejected her. When the legendary Mrs. Astor, the gatekeeper of New York's elite 400, refused to acknowledge the nouveau riche Vanderbilts, Alva did not retreat. She attacked. She built a mansion so spectacular that Mrs. Astor's own daughter begged to attend its opening ball. Alva won. She always won. But winning came at a price, and that price would be paid by her only daughter. From her earliest years, Consuelo learned that she existed to fulfill her mother's ambitions. Alva controlled every aspect of her life with military precision. She selected her daughter's clothes, dictated her opinions, and crushed any sign of independent thought. When Consuelo once objected to a dress her mother had chosen, Alva's response was chilling. "I do the thinking. You do as you are told." The physical control was just as severe. Concerned that her daughter's posture was not perfect enough, Alva forced young Consuelo to wear a steel rod during her lessons. It ran the full length of her spine, fastening at her waist and over her shoulders. Another strap went around her forehead. In later years, Consuelo would describe how impossible it was to write in such a position, how she had to hold her books high just to read. The discomfort was constant and deliberate, but the steel rod was merely a metaphor for something deeper. Alva was fashioning her daughter into the perfect wife for a perfect husband. Not a husband Consuelo would choose. A husband Alva would select. Someone with a title that would elevate the Vanderbilt name above all others. Someone who would prove, once and for all, that Alva had conquered every social mountain there was to climb. When discipline failed, Alva turned to darker methods. She was known to strike her daughter with a riding crop for minor infractions. The threat of violence hung over Consuelo's childhood like a storm cloud that never quite broke, but never truly cleared either. There was no escape. There was no appeal. Alva ruled absolutely, and Consuelo learned to submit. By the time she reached her teenage years, Consuelo had grown into an extraordinary beauty. She was tall and willowy, with a long, slender neck that painters would later compare to a swan. Her dark eyes were framed by curling lashes, and when she smiled, tiny dimples appeared in her cheeks. Writers competed to describe her. One Oxford undergraduate recalled how he and his friends were captivated by her piquant oval face. The playwright James Barrie, author of Peter Pan, famously declared he would stand all day in the street just to see Consuelo Marlborough get into her carriage. But beneath that beauty lived a young woman who had never been allowed to have a thought of her own, a preference of her own, a dream of her own. Until she met Winthrop Rutherford, he was everything her mother would never choose, an American. Handsome, charming, and from an old New York family with an impeccable pedigree, but no title. He was 15 years older than Consuelo, and he was utterly besotted with her. More importantly, she loved him. For the first time in her life, Consuelo felt something that was entirely her own, a feeling her mother could not dictate or control. They became secretly engaged. It was an act of extraordinary courage for a girl who had spent her entire life under her mother's absolute authority. But it was also an act of extraordinary naivety. Consuelo should have known that Alva would find out. Alva found out everything. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, another story was unfolding. A story of crumbling walls, empty coffers, and a desperate young duke trying to save everything his ancestors had built. Blenheim Palace rises from the Oxfordshire countryside like a monument to victory. Unlike any other private residence in England, it was designed not merely as a home, but as a statement of national triumph. To understand how this extraordinary building came to exist, and why saving it became worth more than any young woman's happiness, we must travel back to the summer of 1704. The War of the Spanish Succession had engulfed Europe. Louis XIV of France sought to expand his empire across the continent, and England, along with its allies, stood in his way. John Churchill had risen from modest gentry to become one of the most brilliant military commanders of his age. His wife Sarah was the closest friend and confidant of Queen Anne herself, wielding influence that extended far beyond any title. On August 13th, 1704, near the small village of Blenheim on the Danube River in what is now Bavaria, John Churchill faced the combined forces of France and Bavaria. The enemy position seemed impregnable. French and Bavarian troops occupied a strong defensive line anchored by the fortified village. Most commanders would have waited, probed, perhaps retreated to fight another day. Churchill attacked. What followed was one of the most stunning military victories in British history. Through a combination of tactical brilliance and personal courage, Churchill shattered the enemy line. By nightfall, the French and Bavarian armies were destroyed as fighting forces. The dream of French domination over Europe had been broken on the banks of the Danube. Back in England, church bells rang and bonfires blazed when news of the victory arrived. Queen Anne was overcome with gratitude. She decided to reward her victorious general with something beyond mere titles or gold. She would give him a palace, not just any palace, but a monument that would stand for centuries as a testament to British arms and British glory. She bestowed upon him the royal manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire, along with a substantial grant from Parliament to fund construction. The rent for this land was set at a peppercorn rent of 1 French royal flag, to be delivered annually to the monarch on the anniversary of the battle. Even today, this tradition continues. The architect John Vanbrugh was hired to create something the world had never seen. Working alongside Nicholas Hawksmoor, he designed a Baroque masterpiece that seemed to grow from the earth itself. The Great Hall soared 67 feet high. The long library stretched 300 feet from end to end. The staterooms were adorned with tapestries depicting Marlborough's victories, woven in Brussels with threads of silver and gold. The ceiling of the Great Hall showed Marlborough himself kneeling before Britannia, a map of his famous battle in his hands. But creating such a monument was not easy. The project was plagued by political conflicts, funding disputes, and the legendary temper of Sarah Churchill, the first Duchess. When Queen Anne fell out with Sarah, crown funding was cancelled. The Marlboroughs were forced into exile, returning only after Anne's death. Construction continued, paid for from the family's own pockets. The first Duke died in 1722, before seeing his palace completed. His widow finished the work and was buried in its chapel, her monument as elaborate as any queen's. For generations, the palace passed from duke to duke. Some added to its glory. Others began to strip it away. By the middle of the 19th century, the great Marlborough fortune had dwindled to almost nothing. The agricultural depression that swept Britain made the land nearly worthless. One duke sold off masterpieces by Raphael, Van Dyck, and Rubens just to pay the bills. Still, it was not enough. By the time Charles Spencer Churchill inherited the dukedom in 1892, Blenheim Palace was dying. The roof leaked. The plumbing barely functioned. Paintings had been sold, furniture was deteriorating, and the once glorious gardens had fallen into neglect. The young Duke, just 21 years old, faced an impossible choice. He could watch everything his ancestors had built crumble into dust, or he could find money. And in the late 19th century, there was only one reliable source of massive wealth willing to trade cash for coronets: American heiresses. The phenomenon was so common, it had become a transatlantic joke. Dollar princesses, they were called. Young women with fortunes built on railroads, steel, and commerce, shipped across the ocean to marry titled but impoverished European nobles. The arrangement was naked in its simplicity. The Americans got titles and social prestige. The Europeans got cold, hard cash. Love was rarely part of the equation. Lady Paget, an American-born matchmaker who had married into British society herself, made her living brokering these unions. She knew every eligible duke, earl, and marquis with debts to pay. She also knew every American family with a daughter to place and a fortune to spend. When the young Duke of Marlborough needed money to save Blenheim, Lady Paget knew exactly where to look: the Vanderbilts. For Alva Vanderbilt, the opportunity was too perfect to resist. A duke, not merely an earl or a baron, but a duke, one of the highest-ranking titles in Britain. And not just any duke, but the master of Blenheim Palace, a home so grand it was the only non-royal residence in England permitted to call itself a palace. Marrying her daughter to such a man would place the Vanderbilt name in the aristocracy forever. It would be the ultimate victory. There was just one problem. Consuelo was in love with someone else, and she had no intention of giving him up. When Consuelo confronted her mother about her secret engagement to Winthrop Rutherford, she had hoped that perhaps, just perhaps, her mother might listen. She had hoped to find some small space for negotiation, some recognition that her feelings mattered. What she found instead was fury. The confrontation lasted hours. Alva raged. She wept. She threatened. She called Rutherford a fortune hunter interested only in Consuelo's money. She cast aspersions on his character, his intentions, his very existence. And when none of that worked, she made a threat so chilling it still echoes through the decades. "Do not hesitate to shoot a man if I thought he might ruin your life," Alva declared. Consuelo left the argument exhausted and defeated. But she had not surrendered. She still believed she might find a way out. Then came the next morning. Consuelo awoke to devastating news. Her defiance had caused her mother to suffer a heart attack. Alva was in her bedroom, clinging to life, and it was all Consuelo's fault. A messenger came with a warning. "There will be a catastrophe if you persist." Guilt-stricken and terrified, Consuelo finally broke. She agreed to give up Rutherford. She agreed to meet with the Duke. She agreed to everything her mother wanted. What she did not know, what she would not learn until years later, was that Alva's heart attack was entirely fake. It was a performance, carefully calculated to break her daughter's resistance, and it worked perfectly. The rest happened with terrible efficiency. Alva arranged for Consuelo and the Duke to spend time together at Marble House. In the gloomy Gothic room, with its dark wood and shadowy corners, the Duke of Marlborough proposed. He did not declare his love. He did not speak of passion or devotion. He made an offer, a business proposition dressed in the language of matrimony. Consuelo accepted. She had no choice. Her mother had locked her in her room after the confrontation over Rutherford, only releasing her once she promised to obey. The steel rod may have been removed from her back, but the cage remained firmly in place. The wedding was set for November 6th, 1895. The negotiations over money were handled with all the warmth of a corporate merger. The Duke received $2.5 million in railroad stock, worth more than $90 million today. He also received a guaranteed annual income of $100,000 for both himself and his future wife. Consuelo's father, William Vanderbilt, built them a London mansion as a wedding gift. The exchange was complete. But there was one thing all that money could not buy. It could not buy Consuelo's happiness. It could not buy her willing heart. And it could not buy her silence. As she walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church, tears streaming down her face, everyone who mattered knew the truth. This was not a celebration. It was a sacrifice. The Duke barely looked up from his congratulatory telegrams on their wedding night when Consuelo finally told him the truth. Our marriage was my mother's idea, not mine, she said. She insisted on it, even though there was another man who wanted me. She made me turn him away. The Duke's response was as cold as the winter wind. Really? I take it he was an American. I do not see much point in discussing it any further. And with those words, the cage door closed. The newlyweds traveled to Europe for their honeymoon, but any illusions Consuelo might have harbored about finding happiness were shattered almost immediately. The Duke was brutally honest about his motives. He told his new wife that he had married her only because he felt obliged to save Blenheim. He informed her that he would never return to America because he despised anything that was not British. He made it clear that she was a financial necessity, nothing more. In Paris, he began spending her money immediately. Dressing her like a doll at the House of Worth, he replaced the Marlborough family jewels that previous generations had been forced to sell. He bought pearls that had once belonged to Catherine the Great and the Empress Eugenie. The Vanderbilt fortune was already being converted into Marlborough property. Then they traveled to Blenheim, and Consuelo discovered what kind of prison her mother's ambition had purchased. The palace was magnificent, but it was also overwhelming. 187 rooms spread across a structure so vast that servants used underground tunnels to move from one section to another. The Great Hall soared above her head, its painted ceiling depicting martial triumphs she could not claim as her own. The long library stretched so far that its far end seemed to disappear into shadow. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of Marlborough glory, Marlborough history, Marlborough expectations. But what struck Consuelo most was not the grandeur. It was the cold. Coming from America, where central heating and hot water were standard in wealthy homes, she was unprepared for the damp chill that permeated every room. The palace had been designed for spectacle, not comfort. Fires roared in massive hearths, but the heat barely reached beyond a few feet. She later wrote about the endless, gloomy days that seemed to stretch one after another. And then there was the view from her window. From my window, Consuelo wrote in her memoirs, I overlooked a pond in which a former butler had drowned himself. As one gloomy day succeeded another, I began to feel a deep sympathy for him. It was a darkly comic observation, but the pain beneath it was real. Consuelo was isolated, lonely, and trapped in a marriage that grew colder with each passing day. She was immediately thrust into a world of duties and obligations she barely understood. The hierarchy of aristocratic life was bewildering. Every servant had a specific role, and woe to anyone who confused them. When Consuelo asked a butler to light a fire, he was deeply shocked that she would request so menial a task. He had to send for a footman. The incident was minor, but it symbolized something larger. Consuelo was in a world with rules she had never learned, expectations she could not meet, and a husband who offered no guidance or warmth. His mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, made things worse. She interrogated Consuelo constantly about whether she was in the family way yet. The old woman had made her priorities clear from the moment they met. Your first duty is to have a child, and it must be a son, she declared, because it would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke. The upstart in question was Winston Churchill, the Duke's cousin, who was heir presumptive to the title, until Consuelo produced a male child. The pressure was relentless. Consuelo was not a wife. She was a broodmare with a fortune attached. But amidst all this darkness, there was one unexpected light. Winston Churchill himself. The young Winston was nothing like his cousin the Duke, where the Duke was cold, critical, and obsessed with tradition, Winston was warm, spontaneous, and full of energy. He was the life and soul of the young and brilliant circle that gathered round him at Blenheim, Consuelo later wrote. Whether it was his American blood or his boyish enthusiasm and spontaneity, qualities sadly lacking in my husband, I delighted in his companionship. Winston understood Consuelo in a way her husband never could. Like her, he had American blood through his mother, Jenny Jerome. Like her, he was navigating a world of ancient expectations with modern sensibilities. They became friends, and that friendship would last for the rest of their lives. But friendship could not substitute for the love that was missing from her marriage. In 1897, Consuelo gave birth to her first son, John, who would eventually become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. A year later, she bore a second son, Ivor. She had fulfilled her primary duty. She had produced an heir and a spare, a phrase that would become forever associated with her name. But motherhood, while it brought her joy, could not heal the wounds of her marriage. The Duke was devoted to one thing above all else: Blenheim. The restoration of the palace became his obsession, a consuming passion that defined his entire existence. He spent the Vanderbilt millions on repairs, renovations, and improvements with the meticulous attention of a master curator restoring a national treasure. The staterooms to the west of the Great Saloon were completely redecorated with gilt boiseries in imitation of Versailles. It was an ironic choice, for Vanbrugh had originally designed Blenheim as a subtle rival to Louis XIV's Great Palace, a British answer to French grandeur. Now, with American money, the interiors were being transformed into pastiches of the very palace they had been meant to surpass. Later in life, the Duke would regret some of these changes, but in the moment, he was determined to make Blenheim shine as it never had before. He hired the French landscape architect Achille Duchesne to create magnificent water terraces on the west side of the palace. The project took years and cost a fortune, but the results were breathtaking. 2 levels of terraces descended from the palace, each featuring geometric pools, elaborate fountains, and classical sculptures. The upper terrace showcased a miniature version of Bernini's famous fountain from the Piazza Navona in Rome, a gift that had been given to the first duke by the papal nuncio centuries earlier. The design was more Italian than French in style, despite Duchesne's background, and it created a formal garden that balanced perfectly against Capability Brown's naturalistic landscape beyond. Gladys Deacon, who would eventually become the Duke's second wife, left her mark on these terraces as well. Her facial features were reproduced on the heads of 2 lead sphinxes that guard the second terrace, a strange memorial to a woman whose beauty would later be destroyed by her own desperate attempts to preserve it. The Duke also commissioned an Italian garden with geometric beds and classical sculptures on the east side of the palace, creating his own private outdoor space away from the public areas. He planted over 465,000 trees in the park between 1893 and 1919, restoring and expanding the woodlands that formed the estate's magnificent backdrop. He restored the Great Court to its original layout of gravel and cobbles with raised terraces, removing the lawn that Capability Brown had installed in the 18th century. Inside the palace, he bought tapestries, paintings, and furniture to replace what previous generations had sold. The replenishing began on the honeymoon itself, when he took Consuelo to Paris and began replacing the Marlborough gems that had been dispersed over the years. Pearls that had once graced the necks of Catherine the Great and the Empress Eugénie now belonged to the new Duchess of Marlborough. It was her money that paid for them, but they would remain Marlborough property forever. In many ways, the Duke was a good steward of his inheritance. He understood that Blenheim was more than a home. It was a national monument, a symbol of British greatness, a treasure that belonged not just to the Marlboroughs, but to history itself. He devoted his life to preserving and enhancing it, sacrificing his own happiness and that of his wife, in service of stones and mortar that would outlast them all. But he was a terrible husband. The dinners were the worst. Every evening, Consuelo was required to dress formally and dine with the Duke, even when they were the only ones at the vast table. "How I learned to dread and hate these dinners," she would later write. "How ominous and wearisome they loomed at the end of a long day." They sat in silence, the great silver centerpiece between them blocking their view of each other. Consuelo called it her cache-marie, her hide the husband. As the years passed, the Duke sought comfort elsewhere. He had given up an English woman he loved to marry Consuelo's fortune, and he never let her forget it. Now he began pursuing other women. His attentions eventually settled on Gladys Deacon, another American, dazzlingly beautiful and brilliantly intelligent. Marcel Proust said of Gladys that he had never seen a girl with such beauty, such magnificent intelligence, such goodness and charm. The Duke was entranced. Gladys was a fascinating figure in her own right. Born in Paris to American parents, she had been touched by tragedy from an early age. Her father had murdered her mother's lover in a jealous rage, a scandal that shocked 2 continents. Despite this dark beginning, Gladys had grown into one of the most celebrated beauties of her generation. Painters begged to capture her classical features. Writers composed odes to her intelligence. She spoke multiple languages, read philosophy, and moved through the highest circles of European society with effortless grace. The Duke brought her to Blenheim in the late 1890s, and a strange triangle developed. Gladys became friends with Consuelo, even as everyone knew she was the Duke's true love. They walked together through the formal gardens, discussed art and literature in the long library, and maintained a facade of civility that barely concealed the truth. It was an arrangement that seemed impossible, yet it persisted for years. Consuelo, meanwhile, threw herself into charitable work with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew her. She became beloved among the poor and less fortunate tenants of the Blenheim estate. She visited their cottages, learned their names, understood their struggles. When a child was sick, she arranged for medical care. When a family faced hardship, she ensured they received help. The American heiress who had arrived as a stranger became, for many, the kindest face of aristocratic power they had ever known. Her advocacy extended far beyond the estate boundaries. She championed sanitation reform, studying the problems of food supplies, milk quality, water purity, and ventilation that plagued working-class neighborhoods. She organized donors for the Young Women's Christian Association and used Sunderland House as a base for campaigns against human trafficking, working to stop the exploitation of women recruited for brothels overseas. In an era when the women's suffrage movement was gaining strength, Consuelo became an ardent supporter. She attended meetings, contributed funds, and lent her famous name to the cause. She believed passionately that women should have the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to determine their own destinies. Perhaps her own experience of having no choice in her marriage had taught her the value of freedom. She advocated for free school meals, free health care for children, national insurance for workers, and old age pensions. These were radical positions for a duchess, and some in aristocratic circles looked askance at her progressive views. But Consuelo did not care about their disapproval. She had spent too many years doing what others wanted her to do. Now she was finally doing what she believed was right. During the First World War, she organized relief efforts with tireless energy. She assisted the Red Cross and created an employment service to help the 400,000 servants who lost their positions when mansions were shut down or requisitioned by the government. Many of these were young women with no other skills, suddenly cast adrift in a world at war. Consuelo helped them find new work, new purpose, new hope. She also reconnected briefly with Winthrop Rutherford. In Paris they met again, the man she had been forced to abandon and the woman she had become. For 2 weeks old feelings rekindled. Consuelo was desperate enough to confess everything to her husband. She told him she wanted to run away with Winthrop. She was willing to give up everything, even her children's place in society, for the chance at real love. But Winthrop declined. Perhaps he saw how impossible it would be. Perhaps he had moved on. Whatever his reasons, he sent her back to her husband. The door that had never fully closed finally shut forever. In 1900, with her marriage in shambles and her lover gone, Consuelo found temporary distraction in an affair with Reginald Fellows, her husband's own cousin. She may also have had a liaison with the French artist Paul César Hellot, who painted her portrait several times with unmistakable tenderness. These were desperate attempts to find connection, warmth, anything to fill the emptiness that her gilded cage created. The Duke, for his part, departed for South Africa, where his cousin Winston was serving in the Second Boer War. He was away for 6 months. The marriage was effectively over, though. The formalities would take another 2 decades to resolve. In 1906, the Marlboroughs officially separated. Winston Churchill, now a rising political figure, helped negotiate the terms. Consuelo left Blenheim Palace and took up residence first at Sunderland House, the London mansion her father had built as a wedding gift, and later at smaller properties. She maintained her charitable work and her advocacy for women's rights. She became a leader of the suffrage movement, a frequent visitor to Parliament, and a champion of causes that would have scandalized her mother's generation. Her social circle shifted as well. Where once she had mingled with the Prince of Wales's set, she now spent time with writers, artists, and progressive thinkers. H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and Sir James Barrie became her friends. Lady Astor and Lady Cunard were regular visitors. She had finally found the intellectual and emotional companionship she had always craved. But she was still, legally, the Duchess of Marlborough. That would not change until 1921, when the Duke, wishing to convert to Roman Catholicism, sought an annulment of their marriage. The annulment required testimony that the original union had been coerced. And here, at last, Alva Vanderbilt did something unexpected. She told the truth. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," Alva testified to the papal investigators. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." It was a stunning admission. After decades of maintaining the fiction that the marriage had been a love match, Alva finally acknowledged what everyone had always known. She had traded her daughter for a title. She had broken a young girl's heart for the sake of social ambition. She had done it all, and she was finally willing to say so. The annulment was granted. Consuelo was free. And remarkably, this confession brought mother and daughter closer together. Perhaps Alva's honesty allowed Consuelo to finally forgive. Perhaps time had softened the old wounds. Whatever the reason, their relationship improved in later years. Alva had, in her own way, finally set her daughter free. Consuelo wasted no time. Just weeks after the annulment, on July 4, 1921, she married again. Her new husband was Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and textile heir whom she had first met at her coming-out ball in Paris, decades before. He had been in love with her ever since he first saw her as a 17-year-old debutante. Now, finally, she was in love with him too. Jacques Balsan was everything the Duke of Marlborough was not. He was warm, spontaneous, and genuinely interested in Consuelo as a person, rather than as a source of income. He had made his own fortune in the family textile business and pursued his passion for aviation with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything in life. He had set records in balloons, airplanes, and hydroplanes, and had even worked with the legendary Wright brothers. He was a man of action, adventure, and above all, genuine affection. It was, in Consuelo's words, a marriage of love. The contrast with her first marriage could not have been starker. Where the Duke had been cold and demanding, Jacques was warm and supportive. Where Blenheim had been a gilded prison, their homes in France were sanctuaries of happiness. They established themselves at a grand Parisian hotel, particulier, on the Rue Charles Floquet, a faithful reproduction of an 18th-century French mansion that Consuelo's father had built for her in 1912. The house backed onto the Champ de Mars, with views of the Eiffel Tower, and it became a salon for artists, writers, and thinkers from across Europe. But Paris was only one of their homes. On the Riviera, near the village of Aze, they built a magnificent villa overlooking the Mediterranean. The landscape architect Achille Duchesne, the same man who had designed the water terraces at Blenheim, helped them create gardens that cascaded down the hillside in a series of terraces, each offering new vistas of the azure sea below. Here they entertained a glittering array of guests. Charlie Chaplin came to visit. European royalty dropped by for lunch, and their old friend Winston Churchill arrived regularly, setting up his easel to paint the luminous southern light and reminiscing about the old days at Blenheim. Perhaps the most meaningful home was their country estate at Saint-Georges Motel, a chateau near the forest of Dreux, about 50 miles from Paris. Consuelo poured her creative energy into renovating this property, creating a refuge that combined French elegance with English comfort. The gardens bloomed in carefully planned succession throughout the growing season. The rooms were filled with treasures she had collected during her travels, each one holding a story and a memory. Winston Churchill painted the chateau more than once, capturing its pale stone walls against the green French countryside. He came often, sometimes for weeks at a time, working on his writings or simply enjoying the company of people who had known him since his youth. The friendship between Consuelo and Winston had survived her unhappy marriage, her divorce, her remarriage, and decades of change. It would last until the end of their lives. Alva, perhaps seeking to repair the damage she had done, purchased a neighboring villa on the Riviera to be close to her daughter. The woman who had once controlled every aspect of Consuelo's life now simply wanted to be near her. It was an imperfect reconciliation, but it was something. Meanwhile, the Duke married Gladys Deacon, the woman he had loved for so long. But that marriage would prove even more disastrous than his first. Gladys, desperate to preserve her beauty as she aged, injected her face with paraffin wax. The results were disfiguring. Her mental state deteriorated. The Duke eventually evicted her from Blenheim, and she spent her final decades as a recluse, dying in a nursing home at the age of 96. It was a tragedy worthy of a Gothic novel, and it served as a kind of dark vindication for Consuelo. She had escaped. Gladys had not. But Consuelo never truly left Blenheim behind. As the mother of two sons, she remained connected to the palace that had been both her prison and her duty. Her elder son John inherited the title, and became the 10th Duke of Marlborough upon his father's death in 1934. The Vanderbilt money that had saved Blenheim continued to flow through the generations. The palace that Consuelo had helped restore with her dowry remained standing because of her sacrifice. She continued to help her son maintain and improve the property. She took pride in what her fortune had preserved, even as she cherished her freedom from it. It was a complicated legacy, like everything else in her life. The Second World War brought new challenges and forced decisions that seemed impossible. When Paris fell in June 1940, Consuelo and Jacques faced the terrifying reality of German occupation. They were not safe. As prominent figures with connections to British leadership, especially Winston Churchill, who was now leading Britain's war effort, they could easily have been captured and used as hostages, or worse. They joined the flood of refugees fleeing across France, a chaotic exodus of millions desperate to escape the advancing German armies. Roads were clogged with vehicles and pedestrians. Bridges were being bombed. The France that Consuelo had come to love was collapsing around her. The journey south was treacherous, through a countryside transformed by war into a landscape of fear and uncertainty. They reached Spain, then made their way to Lisbon, the neutral port from which so many refugees were trying to escape occupied Europe. There, they managed to secure visas and book passage on a Pan Am Clipper flying boat to New York. America's Duchess, as some still called her, had finally come home. She was 63 years old, and she had lost everything in France except her life and her husband. But she still had her indomitable spirit, the same resilience that had carried her through decades of unhappiness in her first marriage. She and Jacques settled into an apartment at the Waldorf Towers, then into homes in Southampton and Palm Beach. They called their Florida mansion Casa Alva, a name that honored Consuelo's mother despite everything that had passed between them. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister of Britain, visited during the war years. Some believe he polished his famous Iron Curtain speech there in 1946, on his way to deliver it in Missouri. In 1953, Consuelo published her memoirs. She called them The Glitter and the Gold, and they became an immediate sensation. The book was described as an ideal epitaph of the age of elegance. It told the story of her forced marriage, her unhappy years at Blenheim, and her eventual liberation. It was candid about her mother's cruelty, diplomatic about her first husband's coldness, and honest about the price she had paid for a title she had never wanted. But there was also sadness in those final years. In 1956, her younger son Ivor died of a brain tumor. Less than 2 months later, Jacques passed away as well. After 3.5 decades of happiness, Consuelo was alone again. She lived another 8 years, spending her time between New York and Southampton. She was photographed for Vogue in her 60s, still elegant, still beautiful, still fascinating to a public that had followed her story for more than half a century. She never lost her grace, her wit, or her dignity. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on December 6, 1964, in Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old. But here is the most remarkable part of her story. This woman who had been forced to marry a man she did not love, who had spent the best years of her life in a palace she could not escape, who had sacrificed everything for a family that treated her as a financial asset. This woman chose to be buried not in America, not in France, but in England. She was laid to rest at St. Martin's Church in Bladon, Oxfordshire. The church sits just outside the gates of Blenheim Palace. She chose to rest beside her younger son Ivor, in the shadow of the great house that had been her gilded cage. A year after her death, Winston Churchill was buried there as well. The two old friends, united by their connection to Blenheim and their American blood, now rest near each other in that quiet English churchyard. Today, Blenheim Palace stands as magnificent as ever. The Vanderbilt money that Consuelo brought to her marriage helped save it from ruin, and subsequent generations have continued to maintain and improve the property. The water terraces that the ninth Duke created with his wife's fortune remain one of the palace's most beloved features. The Italian gardens still bloom in geometric perfection. The Great Hall still soars to its painted ceiling, and the long library still stretches toward infinity. Visitors come from around the world to marvel at its Baroque splendor. They tour the staterooms with their gilded boiseries and priceless tapestries. They stand in the small ground-floor room where Winston Churchill was born. They walk the grounds where Capability Brown created his masterpiece of English landscape design. And somewhere among them, perhaps, walks a young woman who pauses in front of the famous family portrait by John Singer Sargent. It hangs in the red drawing room, showing the ninth Duke, Consuelo, and their two young sons. The Duke stands stiffly in his formal attire. The boys pose like little princes. And there is Consuelo, impossibly beautiful, her long neck like a swan's, her dark eyes holding secrets the painter could only guess at. The painting captures a moment from 1905, just a year before the separation that would eventually free her. She was 28 years old when it was made. She had been Duchess of Marlborough for a decade. She had another decade to go before she would be truly free. If you look closely at that portrait, you might notice something strange. Consuelo is not looking at her husband. She is not looking at her children. She is looking somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the frame of the painting, somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, somewhere that perhaps only she could see. Maybe she was looking toward the future she could not yet imagine. Maybe she was looking back at the past she could not change. Maybe she was simply enduring, as she had learned to endure everything, with grace and dignity and the quiet strength that would eventually carry her to freedom. The palace still stands. The portrait still hangs. And the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt still speaks to anyone who has ever been trapped by circumstances beyond their control, anyone who has ever traded their heart for something society demanded, anyone who has ever found the courage to finally break free. She was the original dollar princess, the most famous victim of the Gilded Age's marriage market. But she was also something more. She was a survivor. She was a philanthropist and an advocate for those who could not speak for themselves. She was a woman who endured decades of unhappiness with remarkable dignity and finally found love when she had almost given up hope. Blenheim Palace may have been her prison, but it was never her definition. The steel rod her mother forced her to wear may have shaped her posture, but it never broke her spirit. The tears she shed at her wedding may have marked the beginning of her captivity, but they did not mark its end. In the end, Consuelo Vanderbilt wrote her own story, and that story, like the palace itself, endures. The visitors leave at closing time. The great doors close on another day. The sun sets over the water terraces and the Italian gardens, casting long shadows across the lawns where duchesses once walked and children once played. The palace falls silent, holding its secrets in its ancient stones. But if you listen carefully, you might hear something on the evening wind, not the bustle of servants or the murmur of guests at a party. Something quieter, something like a young woman's voice, finally free at last, whispering across the centuries. I survived. I endured. I found my way out of the gilded cage, and I chose to come back here in the end. Not as a prisoner, but as a woman at peace with her remarkable, terrible, beautiful story. The palace waits. The story continues, and the memory of Consuelo Vanderbilt lives on, as long as these walls stand and as long as people remember what it cost to save them.